Welcome to our spring meeting of the Swiss Community Historical Society. I might warn you that this is going on videotape and means the sound also goes on videotape, and if anybody snores in their sleep, if you feel a little drowsy, why maybe just want to go out. Unless you want your snore down for posterity. So wonderful to see this great group, and if we have to carry in more chairs, and if we have standing room only, we'll have standing room only. So thank you for coming. Today, the Society's Interpretation Committee has planned a history lesson for all of you. A program that centers on the people who have lived in the historic Schumacher House on Pixel Road over the past 173 years of its existence. Think of it, 173 years. Of course, most of those early residents are no longer living, but we will hear from some who have lived in the house, have mowed the lawn, milked the cows, and watched Riley Creek flow past. But before we meet them, we need to tell you about those earlier settlers, the Schumachers, and others who lived in the house for the first 127 years, the years before the Historical Society purchased the property. Rachel Friesen, who is secretary of our 4-member interpretation committee, has prepared a short PowerPoint presentation about the early residents of the house. You will also meet the others on our committee, myself, Joanne Niswander, and Mary Anne Moser, and Jan Emmert. And we will be reading stories told by some of those early residents. Then following that, board member Ron Morrow will lead a panel of 7 caretakers who lived in the house for the 36 years from 1970, when the Society purchased the house, to 2006, when work began to restore the house to what we see today. So enjoy the show.
Thank you, Joanne. This first part of our program has been a joint project between Keith Summer and myself, and I'm very grateful for all of Keith's help, especially with obtaining photos. I also want to thank those who provided technical help: Alice Laura, Armin Habiger, Kate Phillips, the Maple Crest maintenance staff, and Carrie Phillips of the Bluffton University Archives. Information and photographs were provided by Gail Gerber-Kuntz, Joyce Suter, Anna Selfridge of the Allen County Historical Society, Imogene Cully, Carol Kerr Kelly, Ruth Jones Amstutz, Lucille Cully Illig, Joanne Niswander, James Riemann, Gary Laura, Joanne Carr Jones, Paul Smith, and Ron Laura. Thank you to all of these people, and to my husband Ivan for all his support of this project. Our story begins when Christian and Barbara Schumacher left their home in Switzerland and immigrated to Northwest Ohio. They bought the land that is today our Swiss homestead from Thomas Gray in 1836. The Schumachers were accompanied by their 4 young adult children, Barbara, Christian, John, and Peter. In 1843, the construction of the Schumacher house was complete, and the parents, son Christian, and youngest son Peter, moved in, together with Peter's wife Elizabeth and their 3 small daughters. Both Barbara and John had by that time married and established their own farms and homes nearby. This is the earliest photo of the homestead that we have, taken perhaps in the 1860s to 70s. It shows the house, the barn, some outbuildings, and what looks like a split rail fence. Christian Schumacher Jr. died in 1849, Mother Barbara died in 1855, and Father Christian Sr. in 1858. This left Peter and Elizabeth in full charge of the house and farm, which then came into their possession in 1858. Here they lived for nearly 30 more years, farming and raising their unusually large and healthy family of 16 children. Elizabeth Suter Schumacher was the daughter of Elder Christian Suter, one of the first ministers of the old Swiss Mennonite congregation. She died in 1897 at nearly 75 years of age. Her funeral was described in the Bluffton News as, quote, one of the very largest that was ever held here. The capacious St. John's Church was full, end of quote. She had outlived her husband Peter by 16 years and had 123 living grandchildren at the time of her death. Quite a few more grandchildren were born after her death. Unfortunately, we have no portrait of Peter, but we do have a copy of his handwriting. This letter shows him to have had a very good command of the English language. Peter served as a minister in the Swiss church for 26 years. He died in 1881. This photo of the house is thought to have been taken in about 1880. It shows Peter and Elizabeth on the right and their three youngest daughters standing on the porch. Let's glance briefly at the names and dates of birth of the 16 children of Peter and Elizabeth. If you've been inside the Schumacher house, you can perhaps form a mental image of this large family growing up together in that farmhouse. Some of you, can you see that there? Okay, good. So we start with Barbara, Magdalena, Verena, Maria, Elizabeth, Christian P., John, Katharina, Peter P., David P., Adam, Daniel, Benjamin, Susan and Sarah, the twins, and the youngest, Lydia. We have no photo of the oldest daughter, Barbara, who married first Christian M. Amstutz and later David P. Basinger. The second daughter, Magdalena, appears here, seated second from right, with her husband Abraham Bixel and their family. Next was Verena, who married Peter T. Steiner. Maria, who married Christian C. Lugaville. Elizabeth, who married Benjamin Hilty. The first son, Christian P. Schumacher, seated far left, with his wife, Regina Steiner, and their family. John and Barbara Geiger Schumacher and their family. We have no photo of Katharina, who married Jacob Steiner. This photo shows Peter P. and his wife Elizabeth Moser and their family. David P. married Mary Anne Geiger. Adam and his wife Sarah Welty are seated in the center with their children around them. Daniel, whose wife was Sarah Gilliam. Benjamin, who married Sarah Miller. Susan, one of the twins, with her family. Her husband was Ulrich S. Steiner. Sarah, the other twin, married Emmanuel D. Coley. Lydia, the youngest, married Noah Moser. They're seated to the right. Here they are pictured with their children, children-in-law, and some grandchildren. The youngest children were photographed much more than the older ones. This is Sarah and Susan as young women. The three youngest sisters, Sarah, Susan, and Lydia. Lydia as a young woman. Sarah Schumacher Coley, here shown as an older woman, outlived all her brothers and sisters. She died in 1936 at age 74. Her obituary described her as, quote, a daughter of one of the pioneer families of the settlement, and the last survivor of 16 children." Unquote. This family reunion photo in 1907 shows 10 of the 16, and this is the same group with their spouses and children. Shortly after Father Peter Schumacher's death in 1881, the house and farm were passed on to the next generation. Daughter Magdalena and her husband Abraham Bixel moved to the homestead in 1883 and bought it in 1888. Here they farmed and raised their family of 12 children. Abraham and Magdalena were a well-photographed couple, here in middle age. As an older couple, and my favorite, as an elderly married couple. Note the telephone to the left above Magdalena's head. They lived to the unusual for that time ages of 87, Abe, and 83, Magdalena. In 1903, the Schumacher farm passed out of the family when the Bixels sold it to Peter A. and Persis Amstutz. The German settlement column of the Bluffton News described this transaction in detail. Quote, "Our esteemed friend and neighbor, Abraham Bixel, has traded his excellent 144-acre farm to P.A. Amstutz of Pandora for 2/3 share of the dry goods store of P.A. Amstutz and Company of that place. Mr. Bixel has also bought himself a nice residence in that town for $2,700. Mr. Amstutz, who has been in the mercantile business for 10 or 15 years, will try his hand at farming again. He was raised on a farm. While Mr. Bixel will retire actively and will have his son Menno and others to work in the store." End of quote. It is thought that this photo of the house was taken at about that time, in the early 1900s. It seems that the Amstutz's attempt at farming did not last long. Soon P.A. rented out the farm, moved back to Pandora, and went back into business. Peter A. Amstutz was a Pandora merchant for many years. In this picture of his dry goods store, P.A. is standing on the far right. The Amstutzes suffered heavy losses when their store was damaged in the disastrous fire that consumed the business section of Pandora in September of 1900. The Amstutz dry goods store was rebuilt, however, and continued to operate for many years under the name of Amstutz's House of Service. This advertisement appeared in the Pandora High School yearbook in 1925 and lists the merchandise as dry goods, fancy goods, menswear, shoes, tailoring, and groceries. The store was located on Main Street, where the Pandora Public Library now stands. Besides being a businessman, P.A. served as mayor of Pandora and in other official capacities. He and his wife were charter members of Grace Mennonite Church, where P.A. was the first treasurer. The Amstutzes had 6 children: Orpha, William, Harley, Wendell, Margaret, and Roland. Sometime during the Amstutzes' ownership, the Schumacher farm was rented out to Noah and Carolyn Schumacher Gerber. Noah was from Wayne County, but had moved to this area to settle. Carolyn was the daughter of David P. and Mary Anne Schumacher, and granddaughter of Peter and Elizabeth Schumacher, so she was the 4th generation of Schumachers to live in the house. Noah and Carolyn appear here in a later photo with their grown children. Standing in front, left to right, are daughter Melvina, Noah, and Carolyn. Behind them are their 5 sons, Millen, Leland, Myron, Vernon, and Vilas. In 1908, the Gerbers moved off the Schumacher farm. Their farm sale bill is dated March 12, 1908, and the location of the sale is stated as the P.A. Amstutz Farm. That's in very small print way at the top. You can see that. In 1910, the farm again changed hands. The new owners were Gottlieb and Lena Schwab. They were fairly recent arrivals in the settlement, having immigrated from Switzerland in about 1880 or 1890, probably with Lena's parents. If you look closely at this photo of the house, taken some years later, you can see 2 front doors side by side. The Schwabs made the house into a duplex, with one side being the residence of Lena's parents. In his 1947 obituary, Gottlieb is described as a farmer and a member of the Bluffton Missionary Church. Gottlieb and Lena's grandson, Eugene Schwab, appears in this photo in front of the homestead barn. At the very top of the picture, you may be able to see the original horizontal walnut siding of the barn. The sale of the farm by the Schwabs in 1921 initiated a new period in the farm's history. For the next 47 years, it was a property belonging to non-resident owners. Frank G. Colley was a banker in Ottawa, Ohio, before he moved to Lima in about 1924 to become vice president of Dan Kerwin's Colonial Finance Company. He and his wife, Gertrude Bach Colley, lived on Lakewood Avenue in Lima. Their ownership of the farm was likely a business investment rather than having any connection to their family or to a desire to farm. The Colleys are remembered as a wealthy family who made a major donation to St. Rita's Hospital in Lima. We don't know the names of all those who rented the farm while the Colleys owned it, but we do know 2 of them. For 13 years, Clarence and Esther Jones rented the place and farmed it. Esther and Clarence appear here as a younger couple, possibly in the late 1930s, and here, probably in the late 1940s, with their growing family. Clarence and Esther stand in the middle. Behind them are Alice, Clarence Jr., known as Casey, and Margaret. In front of them are Martha, David, and Ruth. 2 of the children are still living, Ruth, who lives in Idaho, and David, who lives in Findlay. We're very pleased to have one of the extended family here today, who lives at Maple Crest. The old bridge, large yard, and creekside were sources of delight to the Jones children. Ruth Jones Amstutz sent us a few of her memories of living at the homestead, and these will be read by Mary Anne Moser.
Ruth Jones Amstutz is the only surviving daughter of Clarence and Esther Jones. From her home in Idaho, she sent these reflections. Our family lived on the Schumacher farm for a number of years. My sisters, Margaret, Alice, and Martha, went to the one-room school, country school. By the time my brother Casey and I started school, we went to the elementary school in Bluffton. I started first grade there. We rode the school bus, and I think that Aaron Messinger was our bus driver. My brother Casey and I were both born in the house. Then my younger brother David was born 6 years later. but at the old Bluffton Hospital on Main Street. I love living there along the creek, fishing and sledding in the winter, skating. We always thought the creek bottom was only ours. Casey and I watched the cows graze along the road and hid in the grass when we saw gypsies coming. I have many wonderful memories of the fun times we had there.
We are also fortunate that the wife of Casey, Joanne Jones, lives here at Maple Crest, as I said, and she was willing to share some memories as well. These will be read by Jan Emmert.
Casey Jones was the older son in the Jones family. And as Rachel said, his wife, Joanne Jones, is here with us today. And she wrote these recollections shortly after his death. Clarence Edward Jones, better known as Casey, was born in 1926 in the downstairs northeast corner room of the old Schumacher house. I think that would be what the parlor is today. This house is now the Swiss Historical Museum. A favorite thing for Casey in his later years was to tell his friends that his birthplace had been made into a museum. Casey's parents, C.E. and Esther Jones, were devout Christians and hardworking people. They rented the farm and farmed it on shares. Things were tough then, for it was Depression times. Everyone in the family learned to work on the farm or in the house or the garden. Casey learned at a young age to do the chores, milk cows, harness and drive the horses to plant crops. Even the girls of the family hoed weeds out of the crops every summer. Casey had 3 older sisters, Margaret, Alice, and Martha. A younger sister, Ruth, was born at the same homestead. Brother David was added to the family after they had moved away to another farm in the settlement. Though they grew up during the Depression, Casey and his sisters didn't know they were poor. They played together and had fun times. They lived on the banks of the Riley Creek and liked to play along the creek. One winter, while sledding downhill toward the creek, Casey ran into some big thorn trees. Though he had many thorns in him, this was church night, so off to church they went anyway. The next day he was taken to Doc Niswander. Casey often played with a neighbor friend, Howard Diller, who was the same age as Casey. Howard's whole family spoke Swiss, so Howard and Casey couldn't even converse until Howard learned English in the 1st grade. The winters were so cold that lots of wood had to be chopped. There was a deep quarry in Riley Creek where the farmers kept ice blocks and stored them in the barns packed with straw for the summer. The Jones family was integrated into the Ebenezer Mennonite Church in the early 1930s due to the friendship with Reverend P.A. Cleaver. Most of the church members were Swiss, and the Joneses found many of the Swiss people hard to understand. There were Basingers, Spallingers, Niswanders, Dillers, Bookers, Looking-Mules, Gristmores, and so forth. Several Sundays per month, the services were in German. Casey became a pretty good sleeper, but jumped right up for the final song. During high school, Casey sang in a quartet with Howard Diller, Bob Gratz, and Leroy Lugadup.
second renter about whom we have information is Louis Cully, who lived at the homestead with his 2 children, Tom and Lucille, for about 2 years. Lucille Cully Illich is still living nearby here, Joanne, Wapak or Delphus? At Delphus. And she has kindly contributed some memories, which will be read by Joanne Niswander.
Lucille, are you here? Was Lucille able to come? Evidently not, but I met her. She's delightful. Lucille Colley Illig, along with her father Louis Colley and her brother Tom Colley, lived in the Schumacher house from 1941 to 1943. Recently, she shared these remembrances of their life on the farm. Lucille's father was a farmer who rented the farm from the owner, Frank Colley, who was not a relative. Lucille's brother Tom was a little more than a year older. Their mother had died when Lucille was young. Her father moved with his 2 children from a farm near Ottawa to the Schumacher place. Although it was not unusual to put minor children in an orphan home or with relatives when the mother died, Louis Colley wanted to keep his children with him. Relatives came at times to help, but Louis did the cooking and Lucille learned to cook at a young age as well. Lucille and Tom liked living beside Riley Creek. They loved playing in and around the creek. She remembers cows swimming in the Riley when the water was high. She and Tom also trapped muskrats along the Riley to make extra money. Lucille thinks that they farmed about 100 acres. They had several cows for milking and horses for plowing. She helped milk the cows. She thinks they probably had pigs and chickens on the farm as well. The barn always seemed a long, long way from the house. The milk house was relatively new, as she remembered. As for the house, Lucille recalls that the living room lay east and west along the entire front of the house. There was a large heat billet to supply heat in the living room. She does not remember the rafters, so there were evidently dropped ceilings when they lived there. The kitchen had a large cook stove with a wood box beside it. There was no indoor bathroom. The privy was not too far from the house, though. Lucille remembers 6 bedrooms. Her bedroom was a small one at what is today to the left at the top of the stairs. The stairway went up entirely differently than it does now. Her brother Tom also slept upstairs, but their father slept in a small bedroom downstairs. There was no summer kitchen when they lived there, but they had a small garage not far from the house.
In 1947, the house and farm were sold to Victoria and Henrietta Magg. We don't know anything about this couple or whether they lived on the farm or rented it out. When they sold the Schumacher place to the Smiths in 1949, the deed listed Victor as living at the Pine Hotel in Bluffton and Henrietta as living in Atlanta, Georgia. That's all we know about them. Othmar and Clara Smith of Columbus Grove purchased the farm in 1949. They did not live in the house, but initially at least rented out both house and land. Later they rented out only the house and farmed the land themselves. The Smiths' first renters were Alfred and Cordelia Kaufman, who remained at the homestead until 1960. They had a family of 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl. Ron and Gary Laura, who lived on the same Bluffton school bus route as the Kaufmans, recall that the 3 youngest children, Gerald, Alfred, and Mary, rode the bus to school with them. Bluffton High School yearbooks indicate that Gerald graduated in 1953, Alfred in 1957, and Mary in 1959. This photo of the Kaufman family was taken in 1966 at the time of the marriage of daughter Mary to James R. Riemann. In the back, left to right, are sons Alfred Jr., who is called Junior, Alvin, Robert, Daniel, Ambrose, and Gerald, who is called Shorty. In the front are Cordula, Mary, the only daughter, and Alfred Sr. Mary's husband, James Riemann, is presently living in Lima. Unfortunately, was not able to be with us today. But he shared memories of Mary's about living on the farm, and these will be read by Mary Anne Moser.
Mary Kaufman Riemann, the youngest child of the Kaufman family, passed away in January of 2016. Her husband, James Riemann, kindly shared these recollections that Mary had told him of her life at the Schumacher Homestead. Mary lived at the Schumacher place from the time she was in the 3rd grade until the year after she graduated from Bluffton High School in 1959. The Kaufman family moved to the farm from Leipzig. They rented it and lived there from 1949 until 1960. Her parents were Alfred Sr. and Cordula Kaufman. Mary was the only girl and had 6 older brothers: Daniel, Robert, Ambrose, Alvin, Gerald, Shorty, and Alfred, Jr. Another brother died in infancy. Mary was impressed with the large fireplace. She could stand in it even when she was 5 feet tall. The family used the fireplace for heat at first, but later another heat source was installed. There was no indoor bathroom when they first moved there, but the outhouse was not too far from the house. Later, indoor plumbing was installed. Mary's dad had 2 horses when they moved there and at first farmed with horses. They also milked cows and raised chickens and hogs on the farm. Their main crops were corn and sugar beets. Mary had to walk the beets, using a hoe to chop down the weeds and to mound the earth over the growing beets to protect them. The family attended St. Mary's Catholic Church in Bluffton. Mary had lessons with a nun or sister from the Sisters of Mercy at St. Rita's Hospital in Lima. The sister was a nurse that came to the parish to help teach the children. Mary and her brothers liked living by the creek and exploring it. Once, when Mary was walking by the creek, she started screaming and yelling for help. The boys came running to find her surrounded by snakes. They responded scornfully, "Did you call us just for that? They're just garter snakes."
The Kaufmans attended St. Mary's Catholic Church in Bluffton. It was located at the corner of Lawn Avenue and Elm Street, a much smaller building than the present Catholic Church building at the corner of Elm and Spring. Other renters followed the Kaufmans: Don Mag, an Allen White family, and a Fly family. In 1968, Othmar and Tara Smith wished to sell the property, and it was purchased by the Swiss Community Historical Society. This photo appeared in the Bluffton News with an announcement of the sale. A new era in the farm's history was beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, grateful very much for this great program. But that's just the half of it. Now we have 8 different people going to be sitting up, so we have to move a few chairs. All of you stay where you are, except the ones that are on the panel with Ron Laura. Ron Laura is going to talk to people who lived there since the association purchased the place. Thank you again, Rachel. That was great.